Well, once again, we want to welcome you to Hope Community Church. We are in the middle of a message series on time. We're calling it Time of Your Life. And over the course of this message series, we've been talking about the fact that we all know our time on this earth is limited. We don't have an endless amount of hours in a day or endless amount of time. We do have bookends to our time here on earth. And so the point of this series is really challenging us to think about how we spend our time, how we use our time. And we want to use it wisely. We want to identify what the priorities in our lives should be and focus in on them. Today we're going to focus on a principle that you could call the playing to your strengths principle. If you want to call it something, you call it that, the playing to your strengths principle. And we're really going to be talking about how we can focus on fewer things but get more done. Focusing on fewer things but getting more done. We live in a culture that almost demands that we multitask, right? We're on our phones while we're on the computer, while we're trying to have a conversation with somebody. It's like, let's try to do all these different things at once because we have so much to do. But what ends up happening is we end up not doing a good job of any one thing when we multitask. And so we want to play to our strengths. We want to focus on fewer things and get more done. It was January of 2008, I think, when I started to work at Bethlehem Church out in Thornton, Pennsylvania. And I was hired there as the children's pastor, and I was very excited and a little bit overwhelmed to be taking on this job. And they gave me a job description, and I'm reading through this thing, and there was a lot of stuff on this job description. It was a page and a half long, which doesn't sound too long, but it was like teeny tiny microscopic, fine print of all these things that I had to do. And I was really overwhelmed by it all. And one of the things that was especially concerning is that as I'm looking at this list, there was only maybe 2 or 3 things on that list that I could do well, at least in my opinion. Okay, these are my strengths. These are things I could do well. But the rest of the things, I'm thinking, I'm not too great at some of these items. There was a lot of administrative stuff that I had to do. There was organizing big events, which is not one of my strengths. I had to make postcards. I had to mail postcards. I had to make copies of CDs and all this kind of stuff that really did not come naturally to me, and stuff that was not really in my wheelhouse. Do people still use that expression? Stuff that I wasn't really good at. And so I was overwhelmed by that, but what do you do? All right, I'm an employee. It's my job. I got to do this stuff. And so what I ended up doing over time, and without really consciously thinking about it, the things that I was good at least I think I'm good at, like, I was working with kids, and I can teach the Bible to children pretty well. I think that's one of my strengths. And so what I ended up doing is I would spend very little time working on those lessons for the kids. I'd pick up the Bible. I knew the Bible story. I knew the main points. I'd already been to Bible college. I'd studied this stuff. I could teach it pretty quickly. Come up with a lesson in 3 minutes. Okay, let's go. Then let me focus on trying to make a postcard and designing it for the next 3 hours, okay? And so I ended up spending a lot of time, again, without really thinking about it, focusing on my weaknesses, focusing on the things that I wasn't really good at because they needed to get done, and it was my job. And so what are you going to do? But that's a mistake. It's a mistake that so many of us make. And if you're, if you're employed, if you have a job where you have some kind of a leadership role, people look to you and they expect you to do certain things. And really, I need to give you a heads up about this whole playing to your strengths principle that we're talking about today. This really is going to be something that you'll be able to apply at work, in your work life, okay? And for those of you who are students, you could probably use it in your student life too. There is an application for your church life, but this principle of playing to your strengths, this is not something that you can apply really in your home life, in your family life, and hopefully that'll make sense as we get to the end of the sermon today. But we want to be able to focus on our strengths, and too often we don't do that at work. Too often all of us have more work than we can manage. I mean, many of us do. And it's just there's so many things that we need to do, and it's like we're the ones getting paid to do it. We're expected to do it, and it's like we just have to get the thing done. And so we end up devoting a lot of our time to the things that we're not really gifted in. When you think about how wonderful it will be where we could really maximize on our strengths, focus on the ways that God has gifted us, and really put those gifts to their full use and their full potential. And so that's really what we're focusing on today. And like I said, this is a mistake that so many of us make because, again, it's not a conscious thing. Nobody sits down and says, you know what, I really want to focus on all my weaknesses, and I'm just going to pour all my time into my weaknesses. Because here's the truth. Here's the thing you already know. Even if you were able to strengthen your weaknesses, Your strengthened weaknesses will never be as strong as your strengths. Did I say that right? Does that make sense? Your strengthened weaknesses will never be as strong as your strengths. That's just the case. And so wouldn't it be great if we could really maximize and focus our time building and developing those gifts, those strengths, the ways that God has gifted us. And so I'm kind of watching your faces as I'm saying all this, and I can see some of you going, oh, yeah, nodding along, thinking, I've done that same thing. I know I spent a lot of my time doing things that I'm not really good at. Well, don't feel bad. You're not the only one. This has been a problem that's gone on for a very long time. In fact, Moses struggled with this very same issue. Earlier this morning, just a few moments ago, you heard part of a Bible passage from Exodus chapter 18. And the section that was read this morning, that's printed on the front of your bulletin. But we're going to be taking a look at some more verses beyond verse 18. So if you have a Bible with you, if you want to turn it open to Exodus chapter 18, starting with verse 13, we're going to see how Moses struggled with this very issue. Moses, you've heard of Moses, right? You know, back in the Old Testament, he was a pretty big deal, right? He was like the guy. God chose him for some reason, and Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and he led this whole nation, this whole slave nation. He gave them freedom, right? Well, God did it, but God did it through Moses, so Moses was a big deal. He was an important guy. He was a powerful leader. And so I need to give you a little bit of a background here to help bring make some sense out of this passage that we're going to be looking at. You have to think about how strange it was for all these Israelites once they found their freedom. They didn't know anything other than being slaves. The Israelites, they had no king of their own. They had no laws of their own. All they knew was what they experienced in Egypt. And they really didn't know their God very well. They knew the false gods of the Egyptians. And here this guy, Moses, is leading them out to go and be God's nation and all of this. But they were really lost. Didn't have laws, didn't have Congress, didn't have, prime minister, didn't have a president, didn't have anything. But they had Moses. Moses was the one thing that they had. And so Moses has this interaction with his father-in-law. And basically, Moses had spent all this time in the desert. He was a shepherd, and he worked for his father-in-law. And so his father-in-law had this little operation out in the desert. And I guess you could call his father-in-law like a chief shepherd, if that's a thing. But his name was Jethro. And Jethro was there with Moses and checking out what Moses is doing. And so, starting with verse 13, the next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And so here's what happened. Moses would just stop. He would be motionless. He would stand or he would sit. And as the leader, what would happen naturally without anybody really thinking about it or without a lot of organization, people would just gather to him and stand in a line. And they asked him, or they required him, and they sort of expected him to serve as their judge. And so whenever there was a dispute among the people, they would bring that dispute to Moses because he was it. And so Moses never made an announcement like all throughout the community, hey, if you have an issue, bring it to me. I'm going to sit here and come on by. I don't think that's how it happened. It just sort of happened. Moses just landed in this position serving as the one and only judge over the nation of Israel. And so there'd be all these things that would come to Moses. And, God had given the people laws, but it's not like people had their own individual copy of all the laws and all the commandments at home where they could reference things and say, okay, well, what am I supposed to do if my neighbor borrows my donkey and then my donkey dies? Does my neighbor owe me something? How does this work? And so issues like that, where there may have been a law in the books, they just didn't know the law. And so they would bring that issue, those kind of issues to Moses, and he just sat there. Okay, and they stood around him, verse 13, from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? What are you doing here, Moses? I don't know what Moses' expectation was. He might have thought that his father-in-law would have been pretty impressed by how important Moses is. Like, hey, check this out, Jethro. Look what I got going on. See how important I am? Everybody wants to talk to me. Everybody wants to hear from me. But no, Jethro says, why are you doing this? What's going on here? Verse 15, Moses answered him, because the people come to me and seek God's will. Why am I doing this? Because the people come to me. They need to know. They seek God's will. And whenever they have a dispute, it's brought before me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decree and instructions. Verse 17. Moses' father-in-law replied, what you are doing is not good. Don't you love to hear that from your father-in-law? Doesn't give you that, oh, yeah, thanks, great. It wasn't saying, now, note this, he didn't say, Moses, you're not doing a good job. He didn't say that. He says, what you are doing, this whole situation, this whole setup you have, what you are doing is not good. You and all these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. So what he was saying here, Moses, is this isn't really good for you, and it's not good for the people. It's not good for the nation, this arrangement you have. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. I wonder how Moses felt when he heard those words. Did he get defensive, or did he immediately recognize, yeah, that's truth. This is true. What my father-in-law is telling me is true. Verse 19, listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. Or in other words, and if you're wise, you'll listen to me. You must be, now here, don't miss this, you must be, not can be, not should be, you must be the people's representative before God. And so here Moses is serving as the one and only judge, settling all these disputes for everybody. And Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, says, wait. Focus on what you must do. You must be the people's representative before God. Now, I don't know if this was a matter of how God had gifted Moses, or just this is a role that God had thrust upon Moses, but he was it. He was the people's representative before God. God spoke to Moses. For some reason, chose Moses to speak to. And Moses had this unique relationship with God where he went before God and could speak back to him and say, hey, God, listen, I know you're angry at all the Israelites because they keep disobeying you, but please have mercy on them. Please don't wipe them all off the face of the earth, please. And they had that relationship. That's what he needed to do, because only he could do that at that time. He had this unique connection with God. He had this unique role. And really, I don't know how much it was about Moses and his giftedness, but it was really about what God had called him to do. It says, you must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes, collective disputes, to him. So Jethro is not saying, okay, every single tiny little issue that the people bring to you, you have to go bring that to God. No. He's saying, okay, as a nation, this is your job. You got to take, as a nation, their issues before God. Okay, their collective issues, their collective disputes. Verse 20, teach them his decrees and instructions, and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. Okay? Focus on being a representative. Only you can do that. Focus on teaching. You're a teacher. You have that ability. You have the law. God's given you the law. God's told you how people are to treat one another. Teach them. Teach them. If you teach them, they can settle some of these issues on their own. So be God's representative and teach. Focus on those few things. Focus on those two things. Verse 21. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide for themselves. This is brilliant in its simplicity. Say, Moses, you can't do this alone. Why don't you use your time doing the things that you're good at, doing the things that we as a nation, that the Israelite nation, they need you to do these things. They need you to focus on being a representative. They need you to focus on teaching. Do those things. But as for this business of judging all these disputes, find other capable people. They're out there. There's plenty of them out there. Find them. Identify them. That's something worth doing. Take the time to find them and teach them how to do this. And this is not really in the text, and I don't want to read between the lines too much because that's very dangerous when you're reading the Bible, reading between the lines. But the chances are that there were people among the Israelites within that community, within that nation, that there were people there who could judge better than Moses. That was probably the case. They probably were more gifted with that ability. They had the patience, the demeanor, the whatever it took, the understanding to really sit as judge and be able to settle these disputes. He said, go find them. There's people out there that can do this. They're capable. They might be able to do it better than you. Find them. Give them this job. And then this will be easy. Everybody wins. It's a win-win. You win, they win. If you do this, verse 23, if you do this, and God so commands, again, okay, if this is God's will, don't listen to me, I'm just your father-in-law, but hey, if this is God's will, God commands, you will be able to stand the strain. You will be able to handle your workload. And these people will go home satisfied. That wasn't happening with Moses sat there from morning till evening, okay? The line never ended. It's not like he finished. No, people were still standing there at night, and it's like, okay, Moses had to say, all right, I'm done for the day. Come on back tomorrow. Oh, we got to come back again. All right? It wasn't working. So Moses could have said at this point to his father-in-law, listen, Jethro, the shepherd, a wise shepherd, do you know who I am? I'm Moses. I think I'll do what I want to do and, keep your opinions to yourself. He doesn't respond that way because he's wise. And he hears the wisdom that's coming from his father-in-law. Verse 24, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. He puts this plan into effect. And again, everybody wins. Everybody won from that, okay? And so Moses, like I said, there was this weird time where he felt like he had to do this because they didn't have a structure. Everybody just came to him. They looked for him for decisions, and so he just kind of did it. He wasn't focusing his time on building up his strengths. Wasn't focusing his time on doing the couple of things that really only he could do. But now, after following his father-in-law's advice, he could do those things. He could be more devoted in serving as a representative, as a representative of the people to God. He could focus on that. He could also focus his time on teaching. Now he had all these different judges that he appointed. He could teach them the commandments so they would be educated and know how to settle these disputes. And so there's the wisdom of God. It's the wisdom that Moses was able to access, and he acted on this. And everybody won as a result of this. So, what's it have to do with you? That's all well and good for Moses, but how does this impact you? Does this impact you? Some of you have very long job descriptions. Some of you are doing all sorts of things, and you feel like you have to do it because you're the job. It's your job. They're paying you to do it. You have to do all these things. So how can you stop that and really be able to focus on your strengths and maximize your strengths? Back when I first started as the children's pastor at Bethlehem Church, as I was going through this time of being really overwhelmed, a friend of mine recommended a book. He said, you have to read this book. It's called Next Generation Leader by Andy Stanley. And I said, who's Andy Stanley? And so I read this book, and thus began my obsession with Andy Stanley. He's a great guy. But I read this book, and it's all about this very principle. Take the time to focus on the things that you're good at, because God has given each one of us certain gifts. Maximize your strengths. Do this. And so here's what I did. I read that book, and I finished it. And the next day I went into my boss's office, and I said, look, see this job description you've given me, this long list of stuff I'm supposed to do? I'm not doing most of it, all right? I'm just going to focus on these 3 things that I can do well. I'm going to maximize my strengths, and that's how it's going to be from now on. And he said, okay, yes, sir, whatever you say, Josh. That didn't happen. I did not do that. And I would not recommend that you do that either. Don't go into your boss Monday morning and say, listen, I was at church Sunday, and the pastor said I really got to focus on my strengths, so I'm not going to be able to do most of these things here for you, all right? That might not work out for you. That probably won't work out for you handling it that way. But what I'm challenging you and encouraging you to do is take a look. Be thoughtful. Be mindful. Think about ways that you may be able to transition yourself out of some of those responsibilities. Maybe you can. I know how it worked for me. I was a children's pastor. I worked at a church, and there were a lot of people that I could turn to as volunteers. And so I could delegate some of those things to other people. Now, this is not a sermon about delegating, okay? That's part of it, all right? I could say, okay, here's somebody who's gifted in that area. Let me see if they want to do this thing, and hand off pieces of my job to other people, all right? Because there are just things that I'm not good at. For example, if you saw on the back of your bulletin, and we've been talking about this for a while, we're having a yard sale here at the theater. We're raising funds for our Kenya mission trip. The only reason we're doing that is because somebody other than me had the idea and is willing to organize it. I can't do that. That's not one of my strengths. If somebody gave that to me as a job, I'd say, what do I do? But somebody else is doing that. Mickey volunteered. Mickey had the idea. She's running it. That's why we're doing it. And so there are things that happen. And we just have to be very careful about how we approach our jobs. And like I say, if you're mindful of this is not something that you can fix tomorrow. This is not something that you can automatically go into your boss and say, I'm not doing these things anymore. But what you can do is, after giving the situation some thought and some prayer, is sit down with your boss, sit down with your supervisor, sit down with whoever it is and say, listen, you know what, I feel like you've hired me to do a certain job, and I'm not doing it as well as I could be. That's acceptable. You could have a conversation like that. You could go into your boss with that kind of thing. And if your boss is wise, he or she will hear you out because they want to get what they can out of you. They want to see you maximizing your potential. So think about that. Dwell on that. Now, I said this principle here really doesn't work at home because you can't outsource stuff at home. It's not like I could say to Holly, hey, listen, I'm not really gifted at changing diapers. That's not one of my strengths, so I'm going to ask you to do that, or I'm going to outsource that to somebody from the neighborhood. They can come in and do that. And, I'm not great at taking out the trash or dishes or really doing anything around the house, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to No, it doesn't work at home. Doesn't work there. But it does work in the workplace, and it kind of works at school too. And those of you who are students, I want you to really take what I'm saying to heart. As you're seeking a career path, as you go on your interviews, as you're looking for jobs, listen to what they're expecting of you. Be honest in those interviews. That's tough. All right, if they say, okay, we want you to do these 25 things, say, you know what? These 5 things right here, I can do these 5 things really well. These other things, I don't know. Have the courage to be honest. Start an open dialogue with your, potential employers. And this also comes into play with your church life here, okay? One of the great things about being a young church, a new church, we're less than 2 years old, is that there are a lot of things that we don't have to do, okay? There are only very few things that we do have here program-wise. We have worship on Sunday mornings. We have some small groups. We have lots and lots of service projects that we do over the course of the year. But there are things that we just don't have yet. For a while, we didn't have any live music. And then God gave us someone who was gifted in that area, and now we do. And so one of the beautiful things about being a new church is that if you have a gifting, if God has given you a strength, an ability, a talent, whatever you want to call it, you can use that here in the church. We don't have to, in other words, we don't have to say, okay, we need to have a kids club every Wednesday night, and we need to have a sports camp every summer, and we need to have a vacation Bible school, and let's go find the people to do that. No. It's the opposite. What we can do is say, okay, let's see how God has gifted this group of people, and then we can do the things that are playing to our collective strengths. Does that make sense? Last Sunday, somebody, as they were leaving, they asked me, when are you going to have a special, Bible club for kids, in elementary age? And my answer was very simple. Well, if God brings us someone who's gifted in that way to lead something like that, that's when we'll have it. I hope that wasn't rude. Was that rude? Should I not have said it that way? But that's just the reality of it. We're a new church, and that's cool. And I remember this, 2 years ago, talking with that plant team about how wonderful this is. You don't have to do anything. You get to do what you're good at. Isn't that fun? Isn't that an exciting opportunity? Because that's what the church should be about. And as far as what the future holds for Hope Community Church, there are a lot of question marks because I don't know what kind of people God will bring to us. I don't know the different strengths, the different gifts, the different talents that people will have who connect with this church. But God knows. And so there's a term for all of this, and it's called organic church. Okay, it's an imperfect term but here's what it means. Basically, we just kind of, let's see what happens as a church, all right? It's an imperfect term because it kind of it robs God of his glory. Really, we're letting God put this together. We're not predetermining things. We're letting God gather people to us. We're letting God, choose people and build up our strengths and make us into a unique thing. And it leaves a lot of uncertainty for the future, but I don't know. I'm really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying being a part of this and seeing, how these people connect and how, programs develop because of the giftings that God has given you. That's a beautiful thing. And so I want you to think about this over the course of today and tomorrow and the week, and really think about how you can apply this principle, playing to your strengths. How can you start to apply that at work? What do you know you're not really great at? I know this, but I have to do it anyway. Is there a way you can transition out of some of those responsibilities? And what I have for you here on the back of your bulletin, there's several questions for you to take a look at. And you don't have to take, the time now to read each and every one, but really, these questions are aimed at helping you discover what you're good at. You probably already know, all right? If you actually go through all these questions and read them, you'll probably say, oh yeah, I knew I was good at that. But if you look at that first one there, what do you do that is almost effortless from your perspective, but seems like a daunting task to others? Think about that, all right? That's one of your strengths, okay? So identify what those strengths are. That's the first thing you need to do. If you're going to play to your strengths, if you're going to maximize your strengths, if you're going to focus your time on your strengths, then you need to know what they are first, right? So discover what they are, and then think about your current job, your current position, where you are right now. Are there things you can do to transition to really maximize your strength? And also consider this, where you are right now career-wise, that might not be the place you stay next year. You might, there might be other opportunities down the road, right? And think about that next thing. And before you go into that next thing, you could say, all right, I know this about myself. I know my strengths. I know my weaknesses. I know what I want to really be able to do. And maybe you can be a little bit more selective about your next employment opportunity. I know in this economy it's tough, but maybe you can. With God, all things are possible. And the reason that we're having this conversation is simply this. God has gifted each one of us. We don't want to see those gifts go to waste. All right? When it comes to your work life, you don't want to see your gifts go to waste. When it comes to your involvement in your local church, you don't want to see your gifts go to waste. Instead, we want to be able to use our time wisely, focus on building up those strengths, focus on maximizing those strengths really. And when we do that, everybody wins. You win, your church wins, your employer wins, your company wins. It's a win-win situation. It will be just like it worked out for Moses, where everybody, the burden, the tension was just alleviated when we were able to play to our strengths. And so I'm really encouraging you, perhaps even challenging you, take a look at those questions on the back of your bulletin. Take some time to ponder these things. Don't let this be one of those messages you hear on Sunday morning and then, by the time you're having your coffee in the back, you've forgotten everything, all right? For your own sake, take some time, dwell upon these things, pray on these things. Let God reveal to you how He has gifted you and discover how you can put those gifts to good work.